This topic of evolution follows universal laws has just literally uh, been presented where the whole process macrocosmically has been put before us in a nutshell of a few minutes. And primarily to give us a framework by which we can study it and apply it to the spiritual evolution of a human being and humanity. So we might say this part of the talk is on spiritual evolution follows universal laws as well. So in the process, we're going to recapitulate some of the ideas mentioned, but also as we go along, apply them to our individual path of spiritual evolution and see how and why they work. So the first idea suggested is that evolution is a process that begins in spiritual unity and ends in spiritual unity. And very often the question comes up, well, if it begins in spiritual unity and it ends in spiritual unity, what's the purpose? Why bother? And the difference is it begins in spiritual unity as a state of being. All souls are fundamentally identical with the universal oversoul. It ends with a self-conscious realization of that spiritual unity. So we might say that evolution is a process by which the soul grows through experience of that to that self-conscious realization of spiritual unity. And how do we begin? Well, we begin with an intellectual concept of the proposition of universal unity and causation. So we begin in spiritual unity, but it's a concept, it's an intellectual idea. But it ends with a truer realization of the self of all and a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. So it's a transformation through evolution spiritually of an intellectual understanding to an actual self-conscious realization and conviction that something is true. And that is our path of spiritual evolution. We also had the idea presented that evolution is a cycle, but it is not but it is a spiral, not a circle. And what that means is that at the end of the cycle of evolution, spirit and matter are raised to a higher degree than they were before. So it's not just an endless series of repetitive cycles, but an endless series of spiraling upwards into greater expression of substance and spirit or consciousness. So what does this mean in terms of our spiritual evolution? It means that our self-consciousness is transformed, expanded, unified. That's what it means for consciousness to be elevated. While at the same time, the matter or substance that the human form is composed of is refined, spiritualized, and made more conductive or more conducive to this increasing, expansive understanding of the awareness. So we might say it's not only the genius that is developing, but the instrument that is developing through the process of spiritual evolution. So spiritual evolution does not leave out the evolution of matter or substance. They are both parts of the same process for us as human beings. Another idea we had presented to us was this idea that evolution proceeds from within and manifests outwardly. But the other half of that is it then proceeds from the objective expression and returns within. So the initial cycle of evolution is from within outward, and then has to be completed by a process of outward going within. And how do we do that in our own individual and human path of spiritual evolution? Well, beginning within. The path of spiritual evolution, as taught by the great sages of all times, begins in the transformation of the mind and heart, the way we think and feel. And a result of that thinking and feeling, the body itself, under law, is transformed. The very substance, the very vehicles that we use during an incarnation is transformed by the previous effort to transform our thought and feeling. But then we are told that the final liberation and the final enlightenment through awareness of the spiritual knowledge of the unity of all has to begin without. And what does that mean? That means our effort has to be for the benefit through deeds of service and practical altruism for others, for other human beings, as we find them. We cannot pursue this path apart from the collectivity of our other human beings and the duties of our everyday life. So by doing that, we allow ourselves to tread the path to full realization of that universal knowledge. So key to spiritual evolution is not just the idea that it's an inward process, but it's an outward process of service. We do not leave our fellow human beings or any department of nature behind while in the attempt of our own spiritual evolution. The fourth idea presented was that evolution proceeds under karmic law, the law of cause and effect, action and reaction. And what this means for us is, as individuals, we are all in a different stage on this path of spiritual evolution. We define it differently, we see it differently, and we practice it differently. And the stage we are at is the result primarily of our individual karma, the acts, the causes we've set up in the past, and they are expressed as effects on our mental, psychic, and physical plane of being. The other half of that is, as we are taught, that the progress of our spiritual evolution is checked by our individual karma. And why is that? Because we are currently experiencing what we might call unexpended karma. We may have the highest aspirations now, but because of the way we've acted in the past, there may be temporary obstacles and blockades in our past that we cannot completely overcome in this particular incarnation. And also, not only is there expended karma, but we are unable to, unexpended karma, but there is karma waiting for us from the past that cannot come through because of those obstacles. So we may have achieved great things in the past, but it can't come through and be felt by us at this point or expressed because of lessons that we failed to learn or obstacles that we have set up. So we have a situation here where karma is not only the means by which we progress, but it is also the instrument through which we face obstacles. So the only solution for the individual on the path of spiritual evolution is total reliance, trust in the law of karma, which is not an outside force, but rather it is the law of our own spiritual being, the law of our being, because there is no karma unless there is a being to make it and to feel its effect. So the key to our spiritual evolution then is reliance on the law of karma. A fifth idea that we were taught is that evolution proceeds under cyclic law. And we're not going to spend too much time on this one because the whole of our preceding month of December really dealt with this issue. And it's basically the idea to recognize that the ebb and flow in the cyclic return of spiritual forces and impulses that drive or come forth come through in a periodical way, and that these can be recognized and utilized not only on a daily basis, but a spiritual basis, in a spiritual way. Excuse me, not only in a daily way, but in a yearly way. So the point is this: why do we take up this idea of the path of spiritual evolution in our ULT in Philadelphia at this year every time? Because it draws our attention to the fact that in this particular cycle, from the winter solstice to the vernal equinox, especially at this time of the year, the spiritual forces are on the rise. And if we direct our mind to that rise through our study of spiritual evolution, we benefit, we ride that wave so much better. A sixth idea: there are three streams of the evolutionary process: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual stream. What does this mean for us? What does it mean to be involved in this spiritual stream of evolution for a human being? For us, we might say, in any one life, as we find ourselves, it is a path of union of our personal mind with our individual higher mind. In other words, we could say it another way. It's a transformation. Our spiritual evolution is a transformation where we start out with individual self-consciousness. We are aware of ourselves as individual self-conscious human beings to the point where we are individually self-conscious of the unity of all. So we no longer think of even though we are individual thinkers, we no longer identify or think of ourselves as separate spiritual beings, but as rays of one source, of one sun, of one self. That is our process of spiritual evolution. But it is not a journey that we make just throughout one life, but through many lives. And in each life, we might say, we progress as spiritual beings, as incarnating egos, to a higher degree of this awareness, of union, self-conscious union with the self. But not only do we become aware, we grow in our power and a character to use those abilities. So it's not just a growth of awareness, it's a growth of power. And so in each life, there is a spiritual harvest of all the effort we've made in that life to our collective spiritual character and power that we pass through many lives. So we might think of as a necklace, a strand of beads, and each one of those beads represents the spiritual accumulation of effort, of power, of understanding that we've garnered from any one life. But our whole understanding is represented by that necklace, by that strand of beads. So no one of us at this particular time, unless we are an adept or a Mahatma, can express the full accumulated wisdom that we've had. But any one of us can add every day, every month, every year, every life, a little bit more to that character and to that power. So in a sense, without that monad, without that Atma Buddhi, spiritual discernment, evolution could not go forward. The path of our spiritual evolution is learning to listen to and follow the voice of the silence, which is the voice of inspiration and spiritual enlightenment of our higher self, of that monadic essence within each of all. So it's one, learning to be a listener and servant of our higher self. And the other path of that spiritual evolution, which depends on that monad, as we said, is to make our thoughts and aspirations every day spiritual enough so that they can be assimilated, they can be digested, they can become part of our character in each life. So when we are incarnated in this life, we are not a blank slate. From our earliest ages, as we know, we bring forth with us an awareness, a character which makes us unique. And that spiritual character, that spiritual awareness is not the product of one life, but it is the accumulated effort of many lives. And it is our attempt in each life to be able to bring more and more of that wisdom and power through until we have the perfection, the flower of the perfected human being on this plane, which we call a great soul or a Mahatma. But a Mahatma is not just a great soul, a Mahatma is also a living human being, meaning that in that attempt to acquire spiritual knowledge, that soul has also raised up the instruments of the human being to the highest possible degree, physically, psychically, and intellectually.